Section 13 of Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 13, December 27th. It is the fashion, I believe, to regard Christmas as a bore of rather a gross description, and as a time when you are invited to overeat yourself and pretend to be merry without just cause. As a matter of fact, it is one of the prettiest and most poetic institutions possible if observed in the proper manner, and after having been more or less unpleasant to everybody for a whole year, it is a blessing to be forced on that one day to be amiable, and it is certainly delightful to be able to give presents without being haunted by the conviction that you are spoiling the recipient, and will suffer for it afterward. Servants are only big children, and are made just as happy as children by little presents and nice things to eat, and for days beforehand, every time the three babies go into the garden, they expect to meet the Christ child with his arms full of gifts. They firmly believe that it is thus their presents are brought, and it is such a charming idea that Christmas would be worth celebrating for its sake alone. As great secrecy is observed, the preparations devolve entirely on me, and it is not very easy work, with so many people in our own house, and on each of the farms, and all the children, big and little, expecting their share of happiness. The library is uninhabitable for several days before and after, as it is there that we have the trees and presents. All down one side are the trees, and the other three are lined with tables, a separate one for each person in the house. When the trees are lighted and stand in their radiance shining down on the happy faces, I forget all the trouble it has been, and the number of times I've had to run up and down stairs, and the various aches in head and feet, and enjoy myself as much as anybody. First the June baby is ushered in, then the others and ourselves according to age, then the servants, then come the head inspector and his family, the other inspectors from the different farms, the mamsells, the bookkeepers and secretaries, and then all the children, troops and troops of them, the big ones leading the little ones by the hand and carrying the babies in their arms, and the mothers peeping round the door. As many as can get in stand in front of the trees and sing 2 or 3 carols, then they are given their presents and go off triumphantly, making room for the next batch. My 3 babies sang lustily too, whether they happened to know what was being sung or not. They had on white dresses in honour of the occasion, and the June baby was even arrayed in a low-necked and short-sleeved garment after the manner of Teutonic infants, whatever the state of the thermometer. Her arms are like miniature prize fighters' arms. I never saw such things. They're the pride and joy of her little nurse, who had tied them up with blue ribbons and kept on kissing them. I shall certainly not be able to take her to balls when she grows up, if she goes on having arms like that. When they came to say good night, they were all very pale and subdued. The April baby had an exhausted-looking Japanese doll with her, which she said she was taking to bed, not because she liked him, but because she was so sorry for him, he seemed so very tired. They kissed me absently and went away, only the April baby glancing at the trees as she passed, and making them a curtsy. "Good-bye, trees," I heard her say, and then she made the Japanese doll bow to them, which he did in a very languid and blasé fashion. "You'll never see such trees again," she told him, giving him a vindictive shake, "for you'll be broken long before next time." She went out, but came back as though she had forgotten something. "Thank the Christkind so much, Mummy, won't you, for all the lovely things he brought us? I suppose you're writing to him now, isn't you?" I cannot see that there was anything gross about our Christmas, and we were perfectly merry without any need to pretend, and for at least 2 days it brought us a little nearer together, and made us kind. Happiness is so wholesome, it invigorates and warms me into piety far more effectually than any amount of trials and griefs, and an unexpected pleasure is the surest means of bringing me to my knees. In spite of the protestations of some peculiarly constructed persons that they are the better for trials, I don't believe it. Such things must sour us, just as happiness must sweeten us, and make us kinder and more gentle. And will anybody affirm that it behoves us to be more thankful for the trials than for blessings? We were meant to be happy, and to accept all the happiness offered with thankfulness. Indeed, we are none of us ever thankful enough, and yet we each get so much, so very much more than we deserve. I know a woman, she stayed with me last summer, who rejoices grimly when those she loves suffer. She believes that it is our lot, and that it braces us and does us good, and she would shield no one from even unnecessary pain. She weeps with the sufferer, but is convinced it is all for the best. We let her continue in her dreary beliefs. She has no garden to teach her the beauty and the happiness of holiness, nor does she in the least desire to possess one. Her convictions have the sad grey colouring of the dingy streets and houses she lives amongst, the sad colour of humanity in masses. Submission to what people call their lot is simply ignoble. If your lot makes you cry and be wretched, get rid of it and take another. Strike out for yourself. Don't listen to the shrieks of your relations, to their gibes or their entreaties. Don't let your own microscopic set prescribe your goings out and comings in. Don't be afraid of public opinion in the shape of the neighbour in the next house, when all the world is before you new and shining, and everything is possible, if you will only be energetic and independent, and seize opportunity by the scruff of the neck. "To hear you talk," said Irais, "no one would ever imagine that you dream away your days in a garden with a book, and that you never in your life seized anything by the scruff of its neck. And what is scruff? I hope I have not got any on me," and she craned her neck before the glass. She and Minora were going to help me decorate the trees, but very soon Irais wandered off to the piano, and Minora was tired and took up a book. So I called in Miss Jones and the babies. It was Miss Jones's last public appearance, as I shall relate, and after working for the best part of 2 days they were finished, and looked like lovely ladies in wide-spreading, sparkling petticoats, holding up their skirts with glittering fingers. Minora wrote a long description of them for a chapter of her book, which is headed Noel. I saw that much because she left it open on the table while she went to talk to Miss Jones. They were fast friends from the very first, and though it is said to be natural to take to one's own countrymen, I am unable altogether to sympathize with such a reason for sudden affection. "I wonder what they talk about," I said to Irais yesterday, when there was no getting Minora to come to tea, so deeply was she engaged in conversation with Miss Jones. "Oh, my dear, how can I tell? Lovers, I suppose, or else they think they are clever, and then they talk rubbish." "Well, of course Minora thinks she is clever." "I suppose she does. What does it matter what she thinks? Why does your governess look so gloomy? When I see her at luncheon, I always imagine she must have just heard that somebody is dead. But she can't hear that every day. What is the matter with her?" "I don't think she feels quite as proper as she looks," I said doubtfully. I was forever trying to account for Miss Jones's expression. "But that must be rather nice," said Irais. "It would be awful for her if she felt exactly the same as she looks." At that moment the door leading into the schoolroom opened softly, and the April baby, tired of playing, came in and sat down at my feet, leaving the door open. And this is what we heard Miss Jones saying: "Parents are seldom wise, and the strain the conscientious place upon themselves to appear so before their children and governess must be terrible. Nor are clergymen more pious than other men, yet they have continually to pose before their flock as such. As for governesses, Miss Minora, I know what I am saying when I affirm that there is nothing more intolerable than to have to be polite and even humble to persons whose weaknesses and follies are glaringly apparent in every word they utter, and to be forced by the presence of children and employers to a dignity of manner in no way corresponding to one's feelings." The grave father of a family, who was probably one of the least respectable of bachelors, is an interesting study at his own table, where he is constrained to assume airs of infallibility merely because his children are looking at him. The fact of his being a parent does not endow him with any supreme and sudden virtue, and I can assure you that among the eyes fixed upon him, not the least critical and amused are those of the humble person who fills the post of governess. "Oh, Miss Jones, how lovely!" we heard Minora say in accents of rapture, while we sat transfixed with horror at these sentiments. "Do you mind if I put that down in my book? You say it all so beautifully." "Without a few hours of relaxation," continued Miss Jones, "of private indemnification for the toilsome virtues displayed in public, who could wade through days of correct behavior? There would be no reaction, no room for better impulses, no place for repentance. Parents, priests, and governesses would be in the situation of a stout lady who never has a quiet moment in which she can take off her corsets." "My dear, what a firebrand!" whispered Irais. I got up and went in. They were sitting on the sofa, Minora with clasped hands, gazing admiringly into Mrs. Jones's face, which wore a very different expression from the one of sour and unwilling propriety I have been used to seeing. "May I ask you to come to tea?" I said to Minora, "and I should like to have the children a little while." She got up very reluctantly, but I waited with the door open until she had gone in and the two babies had followed. They had been playing at stuffing each other's ears with pieces of newspaper, while Miss Jones provided Minora with noble thoughts for her work, and had to be tortured afterward with tweezers. I said nothing to Minora, but kept her with us all dinner time, and this morning when we went for a long sleigh drive. When we came in to lunch there was no Miss Jones. "Is Miss Jones ill?" asked Minora. "She is gone," I said. "Gone? Did you never hear of such things as sick mothers?" asked Irais blandly, and we talked resolutely of something else. All the afternoon Minora has moped. She had found a kindred spirit, and it has been ruthlessly torn from her arms, as kindred spirits so often are. It is enough to make her mope, and it is not her fault, poor thing, that she should have preferred the society of a Miss Jones to that of Irais and myself. At dinner Irais surveyed her with her head on one side. "You look so pale," she said. "Are you not well?" Minora raised her eyes heavily, with the patient air of one who likes to be thought a sufferer. "I have a slight headache," she replied gently. "I hope you are not going to be ill," said Irais with great concern, "because there is only a cow doctor to be had here, and though he means well I believe he is rather rough." Minora was plainly startled. "But what do you do if you are ill?" she asked. "Oh, we are never ill," said I. "The very knowledge that there would be no one to cure us seems to keep us healthy." "And if any one takes to her bed," said Irais, "Elizabeth always calls in the cow doctor." Minora was silent. She feels, I am sure, that she has got into a part of the world peopled solely by barbarians, and that the only civilized creature besides herself has departed and left her at our mercy. Whatever her reflections may be, her symptoms are visibly abating. Section 14. Of Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 14, January 1st. The service on New Year's Eve is the only one in the whole year that in the least impresses me in our little church, and then the very bareness and ugliness of the place and the ceremonial produce an effect that a snug service in a well-lit church never would. Last night we took Irais and Minora and drove the 3 lonely miles in a sleigh. It was pitch dark and blowing great guns. We sat wrapped up to our eyes in furs and as mute as a funeral procession. "We are going to the burial of our last year's sins," said Irais as we started, and there certainly was a funeral sort of feeling in the air. Up in our gallery pew we tried to decipher our chorales by the light of the spluttering tallow candles stuck in holes in the woodwork, the flames wildly blown about by the draughts. The wind banged against the windows in great gusts, screaming louder than the organ and threatening to blow out the agitated lights together. The parson, in his gloomy pulpit, surrounded by a framework of dusty carved angels, took on an awful appearance of menacing authority as he raised his voice to make himself heard above the clatter. Sitting there in the dark, I felt very small and solitary and defenceless, alone in a great, big, black world. The church was as cold as a tomb. Some of the candles guttered and went out. The parson in his black robe spoke of death and judgment. I thought I heard a child's voice screaming, and could hardly believe it was only the wind, and felt uneasy and full of forebodings. All my faith and philosophy deserted me, and I had a horrid feeling that I should probably be well punished, though for what I had no precise idea. If it had not been so dark, and if the wind had not howled so despairingly, I should have paid little attention to the threats issuing from the pulpit. But as it was, I fell to making good resolutions. This is always a bad sign. Only those who break them make them, and if you simply do as a matter of course that which is right as it comes, any preparatory resolving to do so becomes completely superfluous. I have for some years past left off making them on New Year's Eve, and only the gale happening as it did reduced me to doing so last night, for I have long since discovered that, though the year and the resolutions may be new, I myself am not, and it is worse than useless putting new wine into old bottles. "But I'm not an old bottle," said Irais indignantly, when I held forth to her to the above effect a few hours later in the library, restored to all my philosophy by the warmth and light. "And I find my resolutions carry me very nicely into the spring. I revise them at the end of each month, and strike out the unnecessary ones. By the end of April they have been so severely revised that there are none left. There, you see I am right. If you were not an old bottle, your new contents would gradually arrange themselves amiably as a part of you, and the practice of your resolutions would lose its bitterness by becoming a habit." She shook her head. "Such things never lose their bitterness," she said, "and that is why I don't let them cling to me right into the summer. When May comes I give myself up to jollity with all the rest of the world, and am too busy being happy to bother about anything I may have resolved when the days were cold and dark." "And that is just why I love you," I thought. "She often says what I feel. I wonder," she went on after a pause, "whether men ever make resolutions." "I don't think they do. Only women indulge in such luxuries. It's a nice sort of feeling when you have nothing else to do, giving way to endless grief and penitence, and steeping yourself to the eyes in contrition. But it is silly. Why cry over things that are done? Why do naughty things at all, if you are going to repent afterward? Nobody is naughty unless they like being naughty, and nobody ever really repents unless they are afraid they are going to be found out." "By nobody, of course you mean women," said Irais. "Naturally, the terms are synonymous. Besides, men generally have the courage of their opinions." "I hope you are listening, Minora," said Irais, in the amiably polite tone she assumes whenever she speaks to that young person. It was getting on towards midnight, and we were sitting round the fire waiting for the new year, and sitting glubwein prepared at a small table by the Man of Wrath. It was hot and sweet and rather nasty, but it is proper to drink it on this one night, so of course we did. Minora does not like either Irais or myself. We very soon discovered that, and laugh about it when we are alone together. I can understand her disliking Irais, but she must be a perverse creature not to like me. Irais has poked fun at her, and I have been, I hope, very kind. Yet we are bracketed together in her black books. It is apparent that she looks upon the Man of Wrath as an interesting example of an ill-used and misunderstood husband, and she is disposed to take him under her wing and defend him on all occasions against us. He never speaks to her. He is at all times a man of few words, but as far as Minora is concerned he might have no tongue at all, and sit sphinx-like and impenetrable while she takes us to task about some remark of a profane nature that we may have addressed to him. One night, some days after her arrival, she developed a skittishness of manner which has since disappeared, and tried to be playful with him. But you might as well try to be playful with a graven image. The wife of one of the servants had just produced a boy, the first after a series of 5 daughters, and at dinner we drank the health of all parties concerned, the Man of Wrath making the happy father drink a glass off at one gulp, his heels well together in military fashion. Minora thought the incident typical of German manners, and not only made notes about it, but joined heartily in the health drinking, and afterward grew skittish. She proposed, first of all, to teach us a dance called, I think, the Washington Post, and which was, she said, much danced in England. And to induce us to learn, she played the tune to us on the piano. We remained untouched by its beauties, each buried in an easy-chair, toasting our toes at the fire. Amongst those toes were those of the Man of Wrath, who sat peaceably reading a book and smoking. Minora volunteered to show us the steps, and as we still did not move, danced solitary behind our chairs. Irais did not even turn her head to look, and I was the only one amiable or polite enough to do so. Do I deserve to be placed in Minora's list of disagreeable people, side by side with Irais? Certainly not. Yet I most surely am. It wants the music, of course, observed Minora breathlessly, darting in and out between the chairs, apparently addressing me, but glancing at the Man of Wrath. No answer from anybody. It's such a pretty dance, she panted again, after a few more gyrations. No answer. And is all the rage at home? No answer. Do let me teach you. Won't you try, Herr Sage? She went up to him and dropped him a little curtsy. It is thus she always addressed him, entirely oblivious to the fact, so patent to everyone else, that he resents it. Oh, come, put away that tiresome old book, she went on gaily as he did not move. I am certain it is only some dry agricultural work that you just nod over. Dancing is much better for you. Irais and I looked at one another, quite frightened. I am sure we both turned pale when the unhappy girl actually laid hold forcibly of his book, and with a playful little shriek ran away with it into the next room, hugging it to her bosom and looking back roguishly over her shoulder at him as she ran. There was an awful pause. We hardly dared raise our eyes. Then the Man of Wrath got up slowly, knocked the ashes off the end of his cigar, looked at his watch, and went out at the opposite door into his own rooms, where he stayed for the rest of the evening. She has never, I must say, been skittish again. I hope you are listening, Miss Minora, said Irais, because this sort of conversation is likely to do you good. I always listen when people talk sensibly, replied Minora, stirring her grog. Irais glanced at her with slightly doubtful eyebrows. Do you agree with our hostess's description of women? She asked after a pause. As nobodies? No, of course I do not. Yet she is right. In the eye of the law we are literally nobodies in our country. Did you know that women are forbidden to go to political meetings here? Really? Out came the notebook. The law expressly forbids the attendance at such meetings of women, children, and idiots. Children and idiots, I understand that, said Minora. But women, and class with children and idiots. Class with children and idiots, repeated Irais, gravely nodding her head. Did you know that the law forbids females of any age to ride on the top of omnibuses or tramcars? Not really. Do you know why? I can't imagine. Because in going up and down the stairs, those inside might perhaps catch a glimpse of the stocking covering their ankles. But what? Did you know that the morals of the German public are in such a shaky condition that a glimpse of that sort would be fatal to them? But I do not see how a stocking with stripes round it, said Irais, and darns in it, I added, could possibly be pernicious. The pernicious stocking, or thoughts on the ethics of petticoats, said Irais. Put that down as the name of your next book on Germany. I never know, complained Minora, letting her notebook fall. whether you were in earnest or not. Don't you?" said Irais sweetly. "Is it true," appealed Minora to the Man of Wrath, busy with his lemons in the background, "that your law classes women with children and idiots?" "Certainly," he answered promptly, "and a very proper classification too." We all looked back. "That's rude," said I at last. "Truth is always rude, my dear," he replied complacently. Then he added, "If I were commissioned to draw up a new legal code, and had previously enjoyed the privilege, as I have been doing lately, of listening to the conversation of you three young ladies, I should make precisely the same classification." Even Minora was incensed at this. "You are telling us in the most unvarnished manner that we are idiots," said Irais. "Idiots? No, no, by no means. But children, nice little agreeable children. I very much like to hear you talk together. It is all so young and fresh what you think and what you believe, and not of the least consequence to any one." "Not of the least consequence?" cried Minora. "What we believe is of very great consequence indeed to us." "Are you jeering at our beliefs?" inquired Irais sternly. "Not for worlds. I would not on any account disturb or change your pretty little beliefs. It is your chief charm that you always believe everything. How desperate would our case be if young ladies only believed facts, and never accepted another person's assurance, but preferred the evidence of their own eyes. They would have no illusions, and a woman without illusions is the dreariest and most difficult thing to manage possible." "Thing!" protested Irais. The Man of Wrath, usually so silent, makes up for it from time to time by holding forth at unnecessary length. He took up his stand now, with his back to the fire, and a glass of Glubwein in his hand. Minora had hardly heard his voice before, so quiet had he been since she came, and sat with her pencil raised, ready to fix for ever the wisdom that should flow from his lips. "What would become of poetry if women became so sensible that they turned a deaf ear to the poetic platitudes of love? That love does indulge in platitudes, I suppose you will admit." He looked at Irais. "Yes, they all say exactly the same thing," she acknowledged. "Who could murmur pretty speeches on the beauty of a common sacrifice if the listener's want of imagination was such as to enable her only to distinguish one victim in the picture, and that one herself?" Minora took that down word for word, much good it may do her. "Who would be brave enough to affirm that if refused he will die, if his assurances merely elicit a recommendation to diet himself and take plenty of outdoor exercise? Women are responsible for such lies because they believe them. Their amazing vanity makes them swallow flattery so gross that it is an insult, and men will always be ready to tell the precise number of lies that a woman is ready to listen to. Who indulges more recklessly in glowing exaggerations than the lover who hopes, and has not yet obtained? He will, like the nightingale, sing with unceasing modulations, display all his talent, untiringly repeat his sweetest notes until he has what he wants, when his song, like the nightingale's, immediately ceases, never again to be heard." "Take that down," murmured Irais aside to Minora, unnecessary advice, for her pencil was scribbling as fast as it could. "A woman's vanity is so immeasurable that after having 99 object lessons in the difference between promise and performance, and the emptiness of pretty speeches, the beginning of the 100th will find her lending the same willing and enchanted ear to the eloquence of flattery as she did on the occasion of the first. What can the exhortations of the strong-minded sister who have never had these experiences do for such a woman? It is useless to tell her that she is man's victim, that she is his plaything, that she is cheated, downtrodden, kept under, laughed at, shabbily treated in every way. That is not a true statement of the case. She is simply the victim of her own vanity, and against that, against the belief in her own fascinations, against the very part of herself that gives all the colour to her life, who shall expect a woman to take up arms?" "Are you so vain, Elizabeth?" inquired Irais with a shocked face. And had you lent a willing ear to the blandishments of 99 before you reached your final destiny? I am one of the sensible ones, I suppose, I replied, for nobody ever wanted me to listen to blandishments. Minora sighed. I'd like to hear you talk together about the position of women, he went on, and wonder when you will realize that they hold exactly the position they are fitted for. As soon as they are fit to occupy a better, no power on earth will be able to keep them out of it. Meanwhile, let me warn you that as things now are, only strong-minded women wish to see you the equals of men, and the strong-minded are invariably plain. The pretty ones would rather see men their slaves than their equals. You know, said Irais, frowning, that I consider myself strong-minded. And never rise till lunch-time? Irais blushed. Although I don't approve of such conduct, it is very convenient in more ways than one. I get through my housekeeping undisturbed, and whenever she is disposed to lecture me, I begin about this habit of hers. Her conscience must be terribly stricken on the point, for she is by no means, as a rule, given to meekness. A woman without vanity would be unattackable, resumed the man of wrath. When a girl enters that downward path that leads to ruin, she is led solely by her own vanity. For in these days of policemen, no young woman can be forced against her will from the path of virtue, and the cries of the injured are never heard until the destroyer begins to express his penitence for having destroyed. If her passion could remain a white heat, and he could continue to feed her ear with the protestations she loves, no principles of piety or virtue would disturb the happiness of his companion. For a mournful experience teaches that piety begins only where passion ends, and that principles are strongest where temptations are most rare. But what has all this to do with us? I inquired severely. You were displeased at our law classing you as it does, and I merely wished to justify it, he answered. Creatures who habitually say yes to everything a man proposes, when no one can oblige them to say it, and when it is so often fatal, are plainly not responsible beings. I shall never say it to you again, my dear man, I said. And not only that fatal weakness, he continued, but what is there, candidly, to distinguish you from children? You are older, but not wiser, really not so wise, for with years you lose the common sense you had as children. Have you ever heard a group of women talking reasonably together? Yes, we do, Irais and I cried in a breath. It has interested me, went on the man of wrath, in my idle moments to listen to their talk. It amused me to hear the malicious little stories they told of their best friends who were absent, to note the spiteful little digs they gave their best friends who were present, to watch the utter incredulity with which they listened to the tale of some other woman's conquests, the radiant good faith they displayed in connection with their own, the instant collapse into boredom if some topic of so-called general interest by some extraordinary chance were introduced. You must have belonged to a particularly nice set, remarked Irais. And as for politics, he said, I have never heard them mentioned among women. Children and idiots are not interested in such things, I said, and we are much too frightened of being put in prison, said Irais. In prison? Echoed Minora. Don't you know, said Irais, turning to her, that if you talk about such things here you run a great risk of being imprisoned? But why? But why? Because though yourself may have meant nothing but what was innocent, your words may have suggested something less innocent to the evil minds of your hearers, and then the law steps in and calls it dolus eventualis, and everybody says how dreadful, and off you go to prison and are punished as you deserve to be. Minora looked mystified. That is not, however, your real reason for not discussing them, said the man of wrath. They simply do not interest you, or it may be that you do not consider your female friends' opinions worth listening to, for you certainly display an astonishing thirst for information when male politicians are present. I have seen a pretty young woman, hardly in her 20s, sitting a whole evening drinking in the doubtful wisdom of an elderly political star, with every appearance of eager interest. He was a bimetallic star, and was giving her whole pamphlets full of information. She wanted to make up to him for some reason, said Irais, and got him to explain his hobby to her, and he was silly enough to be taken in. Now which was the sillier in that case? She threw herself back in her chair and looked up defiantly, beating her foot impatiently on the carpet. She wanted to be thought clever, said the Man of Wrath. What puzzled me, he went on musingly, was that she went away apparently as serene and happy as when she came. The explanation of the principles of bimetallism produced, as a rule, a contrary effect. Why, she hadn't been listening, cried Irais, and your simple star had been making a fine goose of himself the whole evening. Prattle, prattle, simple star, bimetallic, wunderbar. Though you're given to describe women as dummes Weib, you yourself are sillier far, prattling bimetallic star. No doubt she had understood very little, said the Man of Wrath, taking no notice of this effusion. And no doubt the gentleman hadn't understood much either. Irais was plainly irritated. Your opinion of women, said Minora in a very small voice, is not a high one, but in the sick chamber I suppose you agree that no one could take her place. If you are thinking of hospital nurses, I said, I must tell you that I believe he married chiefly that he might have a wife instead of a strange woman to nurse him when he is sick. But, said Minora, bewildered at the way her illusions were being knocked out, the sick-room is surely the very place of all others in which a woman's gentleness and tact are most valuable. Gentleness and tact, repeated the Man of Wrath. I have never met those qualities in the professional nurse. According to my experience, she is a disagreeable person who finds in private nursing exquisite opportunities for asserting her superiority over ordinary and prostrate mankind. I know of no more humiliating position for a man than to be in bed having his feverish brow soothed by a sprucely dressed strange woman bristling with starch and spotlessness. He would give half his income for his clothes, and probably the other half if she would leave him alone and go away altogether. He feels her superiority through every pore. He never before realized how absolutely inferior he is. He is abjectly polite and contemptibly conciliatory. If a friend comes to see him, he eagerly praises her in case she should be listening behind the screen. He cannot call his soul his own, and, what is far more intolerable, neither is he sure that his body really belongs to him. He has read of ministering angels and the light touch of a woman's hand, but the day on which he can ring for his servant and put on his socks in private fills him with the same sort of wilderness of joy that he felt as a homesick schoolboy at the end of his first term. Minora was silent. Irais' foot was livelier than ever. The Man of Wrath stood smiling blandly down upon us. You can't argue with a person so utterly convinced of his infallibility that he won't even get angry with you. So we sat around and said nothing. If, he went on, addressing Irais, who looked rebellious, you doubt the truth of my remarks, and still cling to the old poetic notion of noble self-sacrificing women tenderly helping the patient over the rough places on the road to death or recovery, let me beg you to try for yourself, next time any one in your house is ill, whether the actual fact in any way corresponds to the picturesque belief. The angel who is to alleviate our sufferings comes in such a questionable shape that to the unimaginative she appears merely as an extremely self-confident young woman, wisely concerned first of all in securing her personal comfort, much given to complaints about her food, and to helplessness where she should be helpful, possessing an extraordinary capacity for fancying herself slighted or not regarded as the superior being she knows herself to be, morbidly anxious lest the servant should, by some mistake, treat her with offensive cordiality, pettish if the patient gives more trouble than she had expected, intensely injured and disagreeable if he is made so courageous by his wretchedness as to wake her during the night, an act of desperation of which I was guilty once, and only once. Oh, these good women! What sane man wants to have to do with angels? and especially do we object to having them about us when we are sick and sorry, when we feel in every fibre what poor things we are, and when all our fortitude is needed to enable us to bear our temporary inferiority patiently, without being forced besides to assume an attitude of eager and grovelling politeness towards the angel in the house. There was a pause. "I didn't know you could talk so much, Sage," said Irais at length. "What would you have women do, then?" asked Minora meekly. Irais began to beat her foot up and down again. What did it matter what men of wrath would have us do? "There are not," continued Minora, blushing, "husbands enough for every one, and the rest must do something." "Certainly," replied the oracle. "Study the art of pleasing by dress and manner as long as you are of an age to interest us, and above all, let all women, pretty and plain, married and single, study the art of cookery. If you are an artist in the kitchen, you will always be esteemed." I sat very still. Every German woman, even the wayward Irais, has learned to cook. I seemed to have been the only one who was naughty and wouldn't. "Only be careful," he went on, "in studying both arts, never to forget the great truth that dinner precedes blandishments, and not blandishments dinner. A man must be made comfortable before he will make love to you, and though it is true that if you offered him a choice between spickgans and kisses, he would say he would take both, yet he would invariably begin with the spickgans and allow the kisses to wait." At this I got up, and Irais followed my example. "Your cynicism is disgusting," I said icily. "You two are always exceptions to anything I may say," he said, smiling amiably. He stooped and kissed Irais' hand. She is inordinately vain of her hands, and says her husband married her for their sake, which I can quite believe. I am glad they are on her and not on Minora, for if Minora had had them I should have been annoyed. Minora's a bony, with chilly-looking knuckles, ignored nails, and too much wrist. I feel very well disposed towards her when my eye falls on them. She put one forward now, evidently thinking it would be kissed too. "Did you know," said Irais, seeing the movement, "that it is the custom here to kiss women's hands?" "But only married women's," I added, not desiring her to feel out of it. "Never young girls." She drew it in again. "It is a pretty custom," she said with a sigh, and pensively inscribed it in her book. End of chapter 14. Of Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 15, January 15th. The bills for my roses and bulbs and other last year's horticultural indulgences were all on the table when I came down for breakfast this morning. They rather frightened me. Gardening is expensive, I find, when it has to be paid for out of one's own private pin money. The man of wrath does not in the least want roses or flowering shrubs or plantations or new paths, and therefore, he asks, why should he pay for them? So he does not, and I do, and I have to make up for it by not indulging all too riotously in new clothes, which is no doubt very chastening. I certainly prefer buying new rose trees to new dresses, if I cannot comfortably have both, and I see a time coming when the passion for my garden will have taken such a hold on me that I shall not only entirely cease buying more clothes, but begin to sell those that I already have. The garden is so big that everything has to be bought wholesale, and I fear I shall not be able to go on much longer with only one man and a stalk, because the more I plant the more there will be to water in the inevitable drought, and the watering is a serious consideration when it means going backwards and forwards all day long to a pump near the house, with a little water cart. People living in England in almost perpetual mildness and moisture don't really know what a drought is. If they have some weeks of cloudless weather, it is generally preceded and followed by good rains. But we have perhaps an hour's shower every week, and then comes a month or 6 weeks' drought. The soil is very light, and dries so quickly that after the heaviest thunder shower I can walk over any of my paths in my thin shoes,
and to keep the garden even moderately damp it should pour with rain regularly every day for 3 hours. My only means of getting water is to go to the pump near the house, or to the little stream that forms my eastern boundary, and the little stream dries up too unless there has been rain, and it is at best of times difficult to get at, having steep banks covered with forget-me-nots. I possess one moist, peaty bit of ground, and that is to be planted with silver birches in imitation of the Hirschwald, and it is to be carpeted between the birches with flaming azaleas. All the rest of my soil is sandy, the soil for pines and acacias, but not the soil for roses. Yet see what love will do. There are more roses in my garden than any other flower. Next spring the bare places are to be filled with trees that I have ordered, pines behind the delicate acacias, and startling mountain ashes, oaks, copper beeches, maples, larches, juniper trees. Was it not Elijah who sat down to rest under a juniper tree? I have often wondered how he managed to get under it. It is a compact little tree, not more than 2 or 3 yards high here, and all closely squeezed up together. Perhaps they grew more aggressively where he was. By the time the babies have grown old and disagreeable, it will be very pretty here, and then possibly they won't like it, and if they have inherited the Man of Wrath's indifference to gardens, they will let it run wild and leave it to return to the state in which I found it. Or perhaps their 3 husbands will refuse to live in it, or to come to such a lonely place at all, and then, of course, its fate is sealed. My only comfort is that husbands don't flourish in the desert, and that the 3 will have to wait a long time before enough are found to go round. Mothers tell me that it is a dreadful business finding one husband. How much more painful than to have to look for 3 at once! The babies are so nearly the same age that they only just escaped being twins. But I won't look. I can imagine nothing more uncomfortable than a son-in-law, and besides I don't think a husband is at all a good thing for a girl to have. I shall do my best in the years at my disposal to train them to love the garden, and outdoor life, and even farming, that if they have a spark of their mother in them they will want and ask for nothing better. My hope of success is, however, exceedingly small, and there is probably a fearful period in store for me, when I shall be taken every day during the winter to the distant towns, to balls, a poor old mother shivering in broad daylight in her party gown, and being made to start after an early lunch, and not getting home till breakfast time next morning. Indeed, they have already developed an alarming desire to go to partings, as they call them, the April baby announcing her intention of beginning to do so when she is 12. "Are you 12, mummy?" she asked. "The gardener is leaving on the 1st of April, and I am trying to find another. It is grievous changing so often. In 2 years I shall have had 3, because at each change a great part of my plants and plans necessarily suffers. Seeds get lost, seedlings are not pricked out in time, places already sown are planted with something else, and there is confusion out of doors and despair in my heart. But he was to have married the cook, and the cook saw a ghost and immediately left, and he is going after her as soon as he can, and meanwhile is wasting visibly away. What she saw was doors that are locked opening with a great clatter all by themselves on the hinge side, and then somebody invisible cursed at her. These phenomena now go by the name of the ghost. She asked to be allowed to leave at once, as she has never been in a place where there was a ghost before. I suggested that she should try and get used to it, but she thought it would be wasting time, and she looked so ill that I let her go, and the garden has to suffer. I don't know why it should be given to cooks to see such interesting things and withheld from me, but I have had 2 others since she left, and they both have seen the ghost. Minora grows very silent as bedtime approaches, and relents towards Irais and myself, and after having shown us all day how little she approves us, when the bedroom candles are brought she quite begins to cling. She has once or twice anxiously inquired whether Irais is sure she does not object to sleeping alone. "If you are at all nervous I will come and keep you company," she said. "I don't mind at all, I assure you." But Irais is not to be taken in by such simple wiles, and has told me that she would rather sleep with 50 ghosts than with one Minora. Since Miss Jones was so unexpectedly called away to her parents' bedside, I have seen a good deal of the babies, and it is so nice without a governess that I would put off engaging another for a year or two, if it were not that I should, in doing so, come within the reach of the arm of the law, which is that every German spends his life in trying to avoid. The April baby will be 6 next month, and after her 6th birthday is past we are liable at any moment to receive a visit from a school inspector, who will inquire curiously into the state of her education, and if it is not up to the required standard, all sorts of fearful things might happen to the guilty parents, probably beginning with fines, and going on crescendo to dungeons, if, owing to gaps between governesses and difficulties in finding the right one, we persisted in our evil courses. Shades of the prison house begin to close here upon the growing boy, and prisons compass the Teuton about on every side, all through life, to such an extent that he has to walk very delicately indeed if he would stay outside them and pay for their maintenance. Cultured individuals do not, as a rule, neglect to teach their offspring to read and write and say their prayers, and are apt to resent the intrusion of an examining inspector into their homes. But it does not much matter after all, and I dare say it is very good for us to be worried. Indeed, a philosopher of my acquaintance declares that people who are not regularly and properly worried are never any good for anything. In the eye of the law we are all sinners, and every man is held to be guilty until he has proven that he is innocent. Minora has seen so much of the babies that after vainly trying to get out of their way for several days, she thought it better to resign herself and make the best of it by regarding them as copy and using them to fill a chapter in her book. So she took to dodging their footsteps wherever they went, attended their uprisings and their lying downs, engaged them, if she could, in intelligent conversation, went with them into the garden to study their ways when they were sleighing, drawn by a big dog, and generally made their lives a burden to them. This went on for 3 days, and then she settled down to write the result with the Man of Wrath's typewriter, borrowed whenever her notes for any chapter have reached the state of ripeness necessary for the process she describes as throwing into form. She writes everything with a typewriter, even her private letters. "Don't forget to put in something about a mother's knee," said Irais. "You can't write effectively about children without that." "Oh, of course I shall mention that," replied Minora. "And pink toes," I added. "There are always toes, and they are never anything but pink." "I have that somewhere," said Minora, turning over her notes. "But after all, babies are not a German speciality," said Irais, "and I don't quite see why you should bring them into a book of German travels. Elizabeth's babies have each got the fashionable number of arms and legs, and are exactly the same as the English ones." "Oh, but they can't be just the same, you know," said Minora, looking worried. "It must make a difference living here in this place, and eating such odd things, and never having a doctor, and never being ill. Children who have never had measles and those things can't be quite the same as other children. It must all be in their systems, and can't get out for some reason or other. And a child brought up on chicken and rice pudding must be different to a child that eats spickgans and liver sausages. And they are different. I can't tell in what way, but they certainly are. And I think if I steadily describe them from the materials I have collected the last 3 days, I may perhaps hit on the points of difference." "Why bother about points of difference?" asked Irais. "I should write some little thing, bringing in the usual parts of the picture, such as knees and toes, and make it mildly pathetic." "But it is by no means an easy thing for me to do," said Minora plaintively. "I have so little experience of children." "Then why write it at all?" asked that sensible person, Elizabeth. "I have as little experience as you," said Irais, "because I have no children. But if you don't yearn after startling originality, nothing is easier than to write bits about them. I believe I could do a dozen in an hour." She sat down at the writing table, took up an old letter, and scribbled for about 5 minutes. "There," she said, throwing it to Minora, "you may have it, pink toes and all complete." Minora put on her eyeglasses and read aloud. "When my baby shuts her eyes and sings her hymns at bedtime, my stale and battered soul is filled with awe. All sorts of vague memories crowd into my mind, memories of my own mother and myself, how many years ago, of the sweet helplessness of being gathered up half asleep in her arms and undressed and put in my cot, without being wakened, of the angels I believed in, of little children coming straight from heaven, and still being surrounded, so long as they were good, by the shadow of white wings, all the dear poetic nonsense learned, just as my baby is learning it at her mother's knee. She has not an idea of the beauty of the charming things she is told, and stares wide-eyed with heavenly eyes, while her mother talks of the heaven she has so lately come from, and is relieved and comforted by the interrupting bread and milk. At 2 years old she does not understand angels, and does understand bread and milk. At 5 she has vague notions about them, and prefers bread and milk. At 10 both bread and milk and angels have been left behind in the nursery, and she has already found out that they are luxuries not necessary to her everyday life. In later years she may be disinclined to accept truth second hand, insist on thinking for herself, be earnest in her desire to shake off exploded traditions, be untiring in her efforts to live according to a high moral standard, and to be strong and pure and good, like tea, explained Irais. Yet will she never, with all her virtues, possess 1,000th part of the charm that clung about her when she sang, with quiet eyelids, her first reluctant hymns, kneeling on her mother's knee. I have to come in at bedtime and sit in the window in the settling sunshine, watching the mysteries of her going to bed. Her mother tubs her, for she is far too precious to be touched by any nurse. And then she is rolled up in a big bath towel, and only her little pink toes peep out. And when she is powdered and combed and tied up in her night-dress, and all her curls are on an end, and her ears glowing, she is knelt down on her mother's lap, a little bundle of fragrant flesh, and her face reflects the quiet of her mother's face as she goes through the evening prayer for pity and for peace. "How very curious!" said Minora when she had finished. "That is exactly what I was going to say." "Oh, then I have saved you the trouble of putting it together. You can copy that if you like." "But have you a stale soul, Miss Minora?" I asked. "Well, do you know, I rather think it is a good touch," she replied. "It will make people really think a man wrote the book. You know I am going to take a man's name." "That is precisely what I imagined," said Irais. "You will call yourself John Jones, or George Potts, or some such sternly commonplace name, to emphasize your uncompromising attitude towards all feminine weaknesses, and no one will be taken in." "I really think, Elizabeth," said Irais to me later, when the click of Minora's typewriter was heard hesitating in the next room, "that you and I are writing her book for her. She takes down everything we say. Why does she copy all that about the baby? I wonder why mothers' knees are supposed to be touching. I never learned anything at them, did you? But then in my case they were only stepmothers, and nobody ever sings their praises." "My mother was always at parties," I said, "and the nurse made me say my prayers in French." "And as for tubs and powder," went on Irais, "when I was a baby such things were not the fashion. There were never any bathrooms and no tubs. Our faces and hands were washed, and there was a foot bath in the room, and in the summer we had a bath, and were put to bed afterwards for fear we might catch cold. My stepmother didn't worry much. She used to wear pink dresses all over lace, and the older she got the prettier the dresses got. When is she going?" "Who? Minora? I haven't asked her that." "Then I will. It is really bad for her art to be neglected like this. She has been here an unconscionable time. It must be nearly 3 weeks." "Yes, she came the same day you did," I said pleasantly. Irais was silent. I hope she was reflecting that it is not worse to neglect one's art than one's husband, and her husband is lying all this time stretched on a bed of sickness, while she is spending her days so agreeably with me. She has a way of forgetting that she has a home, or any other business in the world, than just to stay on chatting with me, and reading and singing and laughing at any one there is to laugh at, and kissing the babies, and tilting with the Man of Wrath. Naturally I love her. She is so pretty that anybody with eyes in her head must love her. But too much of anything is bad, and next month the passages and offices are to be whitewashed, and people who have ever whitewashed their houses inside know what nice places they are to live in while it is being done. And there will be no dinner for Irais, and none of those succulent salads full of caraway seeds that she so devotedly loves. I shall begin to lead her thoughts gently back to her duties by inquiring every day anxiously about her husband's health. She is not very fond of him because he does not run and hold the door open for her every time she gets up to leave the room, and though she has asked him to do so, and told him how much she wishes he would, he still won't. She stayed once in a house where there was an Englishman, and his nimbleness in regard to doors and chairs so impressed her that her husband has had no peace since, and each time she has to go out of a room she is reminded of her disregarded wishes, so that a shut door is to her symbolic of the failure of her married life, and the very sight of one makes her wonder why she was born. At least that is what she told me once in a burst of confidence. He is quite a nice, harmless little man, pleasant to talk to, good-tempered, and full of fun. But he thinks he is too old to begin to learn new and uncomfortable ways, and he has that horror of being made better by his wife that distinguishes so many righteous men, and is shared by the man of wrath, who persists in holding his glass in his left hand at meals, because if he did not, and I don't believe he particularly likes doing it, his relations might say that marriage has improved him, and thus drive the iron into his soul. This habit occasions an almost daily argument between one or other of the babies and myself. "April, hold your glass in your right hand." "But Papa doesn't." "When you are as old as Papa, you can do as you like." Which was embellished only yesterday by Minora adding impressively, "And only think how strange it would look if everybody held their glasses so." April was greatly struck by the force of this proposition. Section 15.
Of Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 16, January 28th. It is very cold, 15 degrees of frost Reaumur, but perfectly delicious. Still bright weather, and one feels jolly and energetic and amiably disposed towards everybody. The two young ladies are still here, but the air is so buoyant that even they don't weigh on me any longer; and besides, they have both announced their approaching departure, so that after all I shall get my whitewashing done in peace, and the house will have on its clean pinafore in time to welcome the spring. Minora has painted my portrait, and is going to present it as a parting gift to the man of wrath, and the fact that I let her do it and sat meekly times innumerable proves conclusively, I hope, that I am not vain. When Irais first saw it she laughed till she cried, and at once commissioned her to paint hers, so that she may take it away with her and give it to her husband on his birthday, which happens to be early in February. Indeed, if it were not for this birthday, I really think she would have forgotten to go at all. But birthdays are great and solemn festivals with us, never allowed to slip by unnoticed, and always celebrated in the presence of a sympathetic crowd of relations, gathered from far and near to tell you how well you are wearing, and that nobody would ever dream, and that really it is wonderful; who stand round a sort of sacrificial altar on which your years are offered up as a burnt offering to the gods in the shape of lighted pink and white candles stuck in a very large, flat, jammy cake. The cake with its candles is the chief feature, and on the table round it lie the gifts each person present is more or less bound to give. As my birthday falls in the winter, I get mittens as well as blotting books and photograph frames, and if it were in the summer I should get photograph frames and blotting books and no mittens. But whatever the present may be, and by whomsoever given, it has to be welcomed with the noisiest gratitude and loudest exclamations of joy, and such works as Ensterkend, Reisend, Herrlich, Wundervoll, and Sus repeated over and over again, until the unfortunate Geburtstagskind feels indeed that another year has gone,
and that she has grown older and wiser and more tired of folly and of vain repetitions. A flag is hoisted, and all the morning the rites are celebrated, the cake eaten, healths drunk, speeches made, and hands nearly shaken off. The neighbouring parsons drive up, and when nobody is looking their wives count the candles in the cake. The active lady in the next schloss spares time to send a pot of flowers, and to look at my age in the Gotha Almanac. A deputation comes from the farms, headed by the chief inspector, in white kid gloves, who invokes heaven's blessings on the gracious lady's head. And the babies are enchanted, and sit in a corner trying on all the mittens. In the evening there is a dinner for the relations and the chief local authorities, with more health drinking and speechifying, and the next morning, when I come downstairs, thankful to have done with it, I am confused by the altar still in its place, cake crumbs and candle grease and all, because any hasty removal of it would imply a most lamentable want of sentiment, deplorable in anybody, but scandalous and disgusting in a tender female. All birthdays are observed in this fashion, and not a few wise persons go for a short trip just about the time theirs is due, and I think I shall imitate them next year. Only trips to the country or seaside in December are not usually pleasant, and if I go to a town there are sure to be relations in it, and then the cake will spring up mushroom-like from the teeming soil of their affection. I hope it has been made evident in these pages how superior I race and myself are to the ordinary weaknesses of mankind. If any further proof were needed, it is furnished by the fact that we both, in defiance of tradition, scorn this celebration of birthday rites. Years ago, when I first knew her, and long before we were either of us married, I sent her a little brass candlestick on her birthday, and when mine followed a few months later she sent me a notebook. No notes were written in it, and on her next birthday I presented it to her. She thanked me profusely in the customary manner, and when my turn came I received the brass candlestick. Since then we alternately enjoy the possession of each of these articles, and the present question is comfortably settled once and for all at a minimum of trouble and expense. We never mention this little arrangement except at the proper time, when we send a letter of fervid thanks. This radiant weather, when mere living is a joy, and sitting still over the fire out of the question, has been going on for more than a week. Sleighing and skating have been our chief occupations, especially skating, which is more than usually fascinating here, because the place is intersected by small canals, communicating with a lake, and the river belonging to the lake, and as everything is frozen black and hard, we can skate for miles straight ahead without being obliged to turn round and come back again. At all times an annoying and even mortifying proceeding. I race skates beautifully. Modesty is the only obstacle to my saying the same of myself, but I may remark that all Germans skate well, for the simple reason that every year of their lives, for 3 or 4 months, they may do it as much as they like. Minora was astonished and disconcerted by finding herself left behind, and arriving at the place where tea meets us half an hour after we had finished. In some places the banks of the canals are so high that only our heads appear with the fields, and it is, as Minora noted in her book, a curious sight to see 3 female heads skimming along apparently by themselves, and enjoying it tremendously. When the banks are low we appeared to be gliding deliciously over the roughest ploughed fields, with or without legs, according to circumstances. Before we start, I fix on the place where tea and a sleigh are to meet us, and we drive home again, because skating against the wind is as detestable as skating with it is delightful, and an unkind nature arranges its blowing without the smallest regard for our convenience. Yesterday, by way of a change, we went for a picnic to the shores of the Baltic, ice-bound at this season, and utterly desolate at our nearest point. I have a weakness for picnics, especially in winter, when the mosquitoes cease from troubling and the ant hills are at rest; and of all my many favourite picnic spots, this one on the Baltic is the loveliest and best. As it is a 3 hours' drive, the man of wrath is loud in his lamentations when the special sort of weather comes which means, as experience has taught him, this particular excursion. There must be deep snow, hard frost, no wind, and a cloudless sky, and when, on waking up, I see these conditions fulfilled, then it would need some very potent reason to keep me from having out a sleigh and going off. It is, I admit, a hard day for the horses, but why have horses if they are not to take you where you want to go, and at the time you want to go? And why should not horses have hard days as well as everybody else? The man of wrath loathes picnics, and has no eye for nature and frozen seas, and is simply bored by a long drive through a forest that does not belong to him. A single turnip on his own place is more admirable in his eyes than the tallest, pinkest, straightest pine that ever reared its snow-crowned head against the setting sunlight. Now observe the superiority of woman, who sees that both are good, and after having gazed at the pine, and been made happy by its beauty, goes home and placidly eats the turnip. He went once and only once to this particular place, and made us feel so small by his blast behaviour that I never invite him now. It is a beautiful spot, endless forest stretching along the shore as far as the eye can reach, and after driving through it for miles you come suddenly, at the end of an avenue of arching trees, upon the glistening oily sea, with the orange-coloured sails of distant fishing smacks shilling in the sunlight. Whenever I have been there it has been windless weather, and the silence so profound that I could hear my pulses beating. The humming of insects and the sudden scream of a jay are the only sounds in summer, and in winter the stillness is the stillness of death. Every paradise has its serpent, however, and this one is so infested by mosquitoes during the season when picnics seem most natural, that those of my visitors who have been taken there for a treat have invariably lost their tempers, and made the quiet shores ring with their wailings and lamentations. These despicable but irritating insects don't seem to have anything to do but to sit in multitudes on the sand, waiting for any prey Providence may send them, and as soon as the carriage appears they rise up in a cloud and rush to meet us, almost dragging us out bodily, and never leave us until we drive away again. The sudden view of the sea from the messy, pine-covered height directly above it where we picnic, the wonderful stretch of lonely shore with the forest to the water's edge, the coloured sails in the blue distance, the freshness, the brightness, the vastness, all is lost upon the picnickers, and made worse than indifferent to them by the perpetual necessity they are under of fighting these horrid creatures. It is nice being the only person who ever goes there, or shows it to anybody; but if more people went, perhaps the mosquitoes would be less lean and hungry, and pleased to see us. It has, however, the advantage of being a suitable place to which to take refractory visitors when they have stayed too long, or left my books out in the garden all night, or otherwise made their presence a burden too grievous to be borne. Then, one fine hot morning, when they are all looking limp, I suddenly propose a picnic on the Baltic. I have never known this proposal to fail to be greeted with exclamations of surprise and delight. The Baltic! You never told us you were within driving distance. How heavenly to get a breath of sea air on a day like this! The very thought puts new life into one. And how delightful to see the Baltic! Oh, please take us! And then I take them. But on a brilliant winter's day my conscience is as clear as the frosty air itself, and yesterday morning we started off in the gayest of spirits, even Minora being disposed to laugh immoderately on the least provocation. Only our eyes were allowed to peep out from the fur and woollen wrappings necessary to our heads, if we would come back with our ears and noses in the same places they were in when we started, and for the first 2 miles the mirth created by each other's strange appearance was uproarious. a fact I mention merely to show what an effect dry, bright, intense cold produces on healthy bodies, and how much better it is to go out in it and enjoy it than to stay indoors and sulk. As we passed through the neighbouring village with cracking of whip and jingling of bells, heads popped up at the windows to stare, and the only living thing in the silent sunny street was a melancholy fowl with ruffled feathers, which looked at us reproachfully as we dashed with so much energy over the crackling snow. "Oh, foolish bird!" Irais called out as we passed. "You'll be indeed a cold fowl if you stand there motionless, and every one prefers them hot in weather like this." And then we all laughed exceedingly, as though the most splendid joke had been made, and before we had done we were out of the village and in the open country beyond, and could see my house and garden far away behind, glittering in the sunshine, and in front of us lay the forest, with its vistas of pines, stretching away into infinity, and a drive through it of 14 miles before we reached the sea. It was a hoar frost day, and the forest was an enchanted forest leading into fairyland, and though Irais and I have been there often before, and always thought it beautiful, yet yesterday we stood under the final arch of frosted trees, struck silent by the sheer loveliness of the place. For a long way out the sea was frozen, and then there was a deep blue line, and a cluster of motionless orange sails, at our feet a narrow strip of pale yellow sand, right and left the line of sparkling forest, and we ourselves standing in a world of white and diamond traceries. The stillness of an eternal Sunday lay on the place like a benediction. Minora broke the silence by remarking that Dresden was pretty, but she thought this beat it almost. "I don't quite see," said Irais in a hushed voice, as though she were in a holy place, "how the two can be compared." "Yes, Dresden is more convenient, of course," replied Minora, after which we turned away and thought we would keep her quiet by feeding her, so we went back to the sleigh and had the horses taken out and their clothes put on, and they were walked up and down a distant glade while we sat in the sleigh and picnicked. It's a hard day for the horses. Nearly 30 miles there and back, and no stable in the middle. But they are so fat and spoiled that it cannot do them much harm sometimes to taste the bitterness of life. I warmed soup in a little apparatus I have for such occasions, which helped to take the chilliness off the sandwiches. This is the only unpleasant part of a winter picnic, the clammy quality of the provisions just when you most long for something very hot. Minora let her nose very carefully out of its wrappings, took a mouthful, and covered it up quickly again. She was nervous lest it should be frost-nipped, and the truth compels me to add that her nose is not a bad nose, and might even be pretty on anybody else. But she does not know how to carry it, and there is an art in the angle at which one's nose is held, just as in everything else, and really noses were intended for something besides mere blowing. It is the most difficult thing in the world to eat sandwiches with immense fur and woollen gloves on, and I think we ate almost as much fur as anything, and choked exceedingly during the process. Minora was angry at this, and at last pulled off her glove, but quickly put it on again. "How very unpleasant," she remarked, after swallowing a large piece of fur. "It will wrap round your pipes and keep them warm," said Irais. "Pipes?" echoed Minora, greatly disgusted by such vulgarity. "I'm afraid I can't help you," I said, as she continued to choke and splutter. "We are all in the same case, and I don't know how to alter it." "There are such things as forks, I suppose," snapped Minora. "That's true," said I, crushed by the obviousness of the remedy. "But of what use are forks if they are 15 miles off?" So Minora had to continue to eat her gloves. By the time we had finished, the sun was already low behind the trees, and the clouds beginning to flush a faint pink. The old coachman was given sandwiches and soup, and while he led the horses up and down with one hand and held his lunch in the other, we packed up, or to be correct, I packed, and the others looked on and gave me valuable advice. The coachman, Peter by name, is 70 years old, and was born on the place, and has driven its occupants for 50 years, and I am nearly as fond of him as I am of the sundial. Indeed, I don't know what I should do without him, so entirely does he appear to understand and approve of my tastes and wishes. No drive is too long or difficult for the horses if I want to take it, no place impossible to reach if I want to go to it, no weather or roads too bad to prevent my going out if I wish to. To all my suggestions he responds with the readiest cheerfulness, and smooths away all objections raised by the man of wrath, who rewards his alacrity in doing my pleasure by speaking of him as an alter Esel. In the summer, on fine evenings, I love to drive late and alone in the scented forests, and when I have reached a dark part, stop and sit quite still, listening to the nightingales repeating their little tune over and over again, after interludes of gurgling, or if there are no nightingales, listening to the marvellous silence, and letting its blessedness descend into my very soul. The nightingales in the forest about here all sing the same tune, and in the same key, E flat. I don't know whether all nightingales do this, or if it is peculiar to this particular spot. When they have sung it once, they clear their throats a little, and hesitate, and then do it again, and it is the prettiest little song in the world. How could I indulge my passion for these drives, with their pauses, without Peter? He is so used to them that he stops now at the right moment, without having to be told, and he is ready to drive me all night if I wish it, with no sign of anything but cheerful willingness on his nice old face. The man of wrath deplores these eccentric tastes, as he calls them, of mine, but has given up trying to prevent me indulging them, because while he is deploringly in one part of the house, I have slipped out at a door in the other, and am gone before he can catch me, and have reached and am lost in the shadows of the forest by the time he has discovered that I am nowhere to be found. The brightness of Peter's perfections are sullied, however, by one spot, and that is that as age creeps upon him, he not only cannot hold the horses in if they don't want to be held in, but he goes to sleep sometimes on his box if I have him out too soon after lunch, and has upset me twice within the last year. Once last winter out of a sleigh, and once this summer when the horses shied at a bicycle and bolted into the ditch on one side of the chassis. German for high road, and the bicycle was so terrified at the horses shying that it shied too into the ditch on the other side, and the carriage was smashed, and the bicycle was smashed, and we were all very unhappy, except Peter, who never lost his pleasant smile, and looked so placid that my tongue clave to the roof of my mouth when I tried to make it scold him. But I should think he ought to have been thoroughly scolded on an occasion like that, said Minora, to whom I had been telling this story as we wandered on the yellow sands while the horses were being put in the sleigh, and she glanced nervously up at Peter, whose mild head was visible between the bushes above us. "Shall we get home before dark?" she asked. The sun had altogether disappeared behind the pines, and only the very highest of the little clouds were still pink. Out at sea the mists were creeping up, and the sails of the fishing smacks had turned a dull brown. A flight of wild geese passed across the disk of the moon with loud cacklings. "Before dark?" echoed Irais. "I should think not. It is dark now nearly in the forest, and we shall have the loveliest moonlight drive back." "But it is surely very dangerous to let a man who goes to sleep drive you," said Minora apprehensively. "But it's such an old dear," I said. "Yes, yes, no doubt," she replied tastily. "But there are wakeful old dears to be had, and on a box they are preferable." Irais laughed. "You are growing quite amusing, Miss Minora," she said. "He isn't on a box to day," said I, "and I never knew him to go to sleep standing up behind us on a sleigh." But Minora was not to be appeased, and muttered something about seeing no fun in foolhardiness, which shows how alarmed she was, for it was rude. Peter, however, behaved beautifully on the way home, and Irais and I at least were as happy as possible driving back, with all the glories of the western sky flashing at us every now and then at the end of a long avenue as we swiftly passed, and later on, when they had faded, myriads of stars in the narrow black strip of sky over our heads. It was bitterly cold, and Minora was silent, and not in the least inclined to laugh with us, as she had been 6 hours before. "Have you enjoyed yourself, Miss Minora?" inquired Irais, as we got out of the forest on to the chaussee, and the lights of the village before ours twinkled in the distance. "How many degrees do you suppose there are now?" was Minora's reply to this question. "Degrees? Of frost? Oh, dear me, are you cold?" cried Irais solicitously. "Well, it isn't exactly warm, is it?" said Minora sulkily, and Irais pinched me. "Well, but think how much colder you would have been without all that fur you ate for lunch inside you," she said. "And what a nice chapter you will be able to write about the Baltic," said I. "Why, it is practically certain that you are the first English person who has ever been to just this part of it." "Isn't there some English poem," said Irais, "about being the first who ever burst into that silent sea?" finished Minora hastily. "You can't quote that without its context, you know." "But I wasn't going to," said Irais meekly. "I only paused to breathe. I must breathe, or perhaps I might die." The lights from my energetic friend's schloss shone brightly down upon us as we passed round the base of the hill on which it stands. She is very proud of this hill, as well she may be, seeing that it is the only one in the whole district. "Do you never go there?" asked Minora, jerking her head in the direction of the house. "Sometimes. She is a very busy woman, and I should feel I was in the way if I went often." "It would be interesting to see another North German interior," said Minora, "and I should be obliged if you would take me." "But I can't fall upon her suddenly with a strange girl," I protested, "and we are not at all on such intimate terms as to justify my taking all my visitors to see her." "What do you want to see another interior for?" said Irais. "I can tell you what it's like, and if you went nobody would speak to you, and if you were to ask questions and began to take notes, the good lady would stare at you in the frankest amazement and think Elizabeth had brought a young lunatic out for an airing. Everybody is not as patient as Elizabeth," added Irais, anxious to pay off old scores. "I would do a great deal for you, Minora," I said, "but I can't do that." "If we went," said Irais, "Elizabeth and I would be placed with great ceremony on a sofa behind a large polished oval table with a crochet mat in the centre. It has got a crochet mat in the centre, hasn't it?" I nodded. "And you would sit on one of the four little podgy, buttony, tassely red chairs that are ranged on the other side of the table facing the sofa. They are red, Elizabeth?" Again I nodded. "The floor is painted yellow, and there is no carpet except a rug in front of the sofa. The paper is dark chocolate color, almost black. That is in order that after years of use the dirt may not show, and the room need not be done up. Dirt is like wickedness, you see, Miss Minora. It being there never matters. It is only when it shows so much as to be apparent to everybody that we are ashamed of it. At intervals around the high walls are chairs and cabinets with lamps on them, and in one corner is a great white cold stove. Or is it a majolica?" she asked, turning to me. "No, it is white. There are a great many lovely big windows all ready to let in the air and the sun, but they are as carefully covered with brown lace curtains under heavy stuff ones as though a whole row of houses were just opposite, with peering eyes at every window, trying to look in, instead of there only being fields and trees and birds. No fire, no sunlight, no books, no flowers, but a consoling smell of red cabbage coming up under the door, mixed, in due season, with soap suds." "When did you go there?" asked Minora. Ah, when did I go there indeed? When did I not go there? I have been calling there all my life. Minora's eyes rolled doubtfully first at me, then at Irais from the depths of her head wrappings. They are large eyes with long dark eyelashes, and far be it from me to deny that each eye taken by itself is fine, but they are put in all wrong. "The only thing you would learn there," went on Irais, "would be the significance of sofa corners in Germany. If we three went there together, I should be ushered into the right-hand corner of the sofa, because it is the place of honor, and I am the greatest stranger. Elizabeth would be invited to seat herself in the left-hand corner, and next in importance the hostess would sit near us in an armchair, and you as a person of no importance whatever, would either be left to sit where you could, or would be put on a chair facing us, and with the entire breadth of the table between us, to mark the immense social gulf that separates the married woman from the mere virgin. These sofa corners make the drawing of nice distinctions possible in a way that nothing else could. The world might come to an end and create less sensation in doing it than you would, Miss Minora, if by any chance you got into the right-hand corner of one. That you were put on a chair on the other side of the table places you at once in the scale of precedence, and exactly defines your social position, or rather your complete want of a social position. And Irais tilted her nose ever so little heavenwards. "Note it," she said, "as the heading of your next chapter." "Note what?" asked Minora impatiently. "Why, the subtle significance of sofas, of course," replied Irais. "If," she continued, as Minora made no reply appreciative of this suggestion, "you were to call unexpectedly, the bad luck which pursues the innocent would most likely make you hit on a washing day, and the distracted mistress of the house would keep you waiting in the cold room so long while she changed her dress that you would begin to fear you were to be left to perish from want and hunger. And when she did appear, would show by the bitterness of her welcoming smile the rage that was boiling in her heart." "But what has the mistress of the house to do with washing?" "What has she to do with washing? Oh, you sweet innocent! Pardon my familiarity, but such ignorance of country life customs is very touching in one who is writing a book about them." "Oh, I have no doubt I am very ignorant," said Minora loftily. "Seasons of washing," explained Irais, "are seasons set apart by the house-frau to be kept holy. They only occur every 2 or 3 months, and while they are going on the whole house is in uproar, every other consideration sacrificed, husband and children sunk into insignificance, and no one approaching or interfering with the mistress of the house during these days of purification but at their peril." "You don't really mean," said Minora, "that you only wash your clothes 4 times a year?" "Yes, I do mean it," replied Irais. "Well, I think that is very disgusting," said Minora emphatically. Irais raised those pretty delicate eyebrows of hers. "Then you must take care and not marry a German," she said. "But what is the object of it?" went on Minora. "Why, to clean the linen, I suppose." "Yes, yes, but why only at such long intervals?" "It is an outward and visible sign of vast possessions in the shape of linen. If you were to want to have your clothes washed every week, as you do in England, you would be put down as a person who only has just enough to last that length of time, and would be an object of general contempt." "But I should be a clean object," cried Minora, "and my house would not be full of accumulated dirt." We said nothing. There was nothing to be said. "It must be a happy land, that England of yours," Irais remarked, after a while with a sigh, a beatific vision no doubt presenting itself to her mind of a land full of washerwomen and agile gentlemen darting at door-handles. "It is a clean land, at any rate," replied Minora. "I don't want to go and live in it," I said, for we were driving up to the house, and a memory of fogs and umbrellas came into my mind as I looked up fondly at its dear old west front, and I felt that what I want is to live and die just here, and that there never was such a happy woman as Elizabeth. End of section 16. Of Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 17, April 18th. I have been so busy ever since Irais and Minora left that I can hardly believe the spring is here, and the garden hurrying on its green and flowered petticoat, only its petticoat as yet, for though the underwood is a fairyland of tender little leaves, the trees above are still quite bare. February was gone before I well knew that it had come, so deeply was I engaged in making hotbeds and having them sown with petunias, verbenas, and nicotina affinis, while no less than 30 are dedicated solely to vegetables, it having been borne in upon me lately that vegetables must be interesting things to grow, besides possessing solid virtues not given to flowers, and that I might as well take the orchard and kitchen garden under my wing. So I have rushed in with all the zeal of utter inexperience, and my February evenings were spent poring over gardening books, and my days in applying the freshly absorbed wisdom. Who says that February is a dull, sad, slow month in the country? It was of the cheerfullest, swiftest description here, and its mild days enabled me to get on beautifully with the digging and manuring, and filled my rooms with snowdrops. The longer I live, the greater is my respect and affection for manure in all its forms, and already, though the year is so young, a considerable portion of its pin money has been spent on artificial manure. The Man of Wrath says he never met a young woman who spent her money that way before. I remarked that it must be nice to have an original wife, and he retorted that the word original hardly described me, and that the word eccentric was the one required. Very well, I suppose I am eccentric, since even my husband says so, but if my eccentricities are of such a practical nature as to result later in the biggest cauliflowers and tenderest lettuce in Prussia, why then he ought to be the first to rise up and call me blessed. I sent to England for vegetable marrow seeds, as they are not grown here, and people try and make boiled cucumbers take their place, but boiled cucumbers are nasty things, and I don't see why marrows should not do here perfectly well. These and primrose roots are the English contributions to my garden. I brought over the roots in a tin box last time I came from England, and am anxious to see whether they will consent to live here. Certain it is that they don't exist in the fatherland, so I can only conclude the winter kills them, for surely, if such lovely things would grow, they never would have been overlooked. Irais is deeply interested in the experiment. She reads so many English books, and has heard so much about primroses, and they have got so mixed up in her mind with leagues and dames and Disraelis, that she longs to see the mysterious political flower, and has made me promise to telegraph when it appears, and she will come over. But they are not going to do anything this year, and I only hope those cold days did not send them off to the paradise of flowers. I am afraid their first impression of Germany was a chilly one. Irais writes about once a week, and inquires after the garden and the babies, and announces her intention of coming back as soon as the numerous relations staying with her have left, which they won't do, she wrote the other day, until the first frost snips them off, when they will disappear like belated dahlias, double ones, of course, for single dahlias are too charming to be compared to relations. I have every sort of cousin and uncle and aunt here, and here they have been ever since my husband's birthday. Not the same ones exactly, but I get so confused that I never know where one ends and the other begins. My husband goes off after breakfast to look at his crops, he says, and I am left at their mercy. I wish I had crops to go and look at. I should be grateful, even for one, and would look at it from morning till night, and quite stare it out of countenance, sooner than stay at home and have the truth told me by enigmatic aunts. Do you know my Aunt Bertha? She, in particular, spends her time propounding obscure questions for my solution. I get so tired and worried trying to guess the answers, which are always truths supposed to be good for me to hear. "Why do you wear your hair on your forehead?" she asks, and that sets me off wondering why I do wear it on my forehead, and what she wants to know for, or whether she does know and only wants to know if I will answer truthfully. "I'm sure I don't know, aunt," I say meekly, after puzzling over it for ever so long. "Perhaps my maid knows. Shall I ring and ask her?" And then she informs me that I wear it so to hide my ugly line, she says, I have down the middle of my forehead, and that betokens a listless and discontented disposition. Well, if she knew, what did she ask me for? Whenever I am with them they ask me riddles like that, and I simply lead a dog's life. Oh, my dear relations, are like drugs, useful sometimes and even pleasant if taken in small quantities and seldom, but dreadfully pernicious on the whole, and the truly wise avoid them. From Minora I have only had one communication since her departure, in which she thanked me for her pleasant visit, and said she was sending me a bottle of English embrocation to rub on my bruises after skating; that it was wonderful stuff, and she was sure I would like it, and that it cost 2 marks, and would I send the stamps. I pondered long over this. Was it a parting hit, intended as revenge for our having laughed at her? Was she personally interested in the sale of embrocation, or was it merely Minora's idea of a graceful return for my hospitality? As for bruises, nobody who skates decently regards it as a bruise-producing exercise, and whenever there were any they were all on Minora, but she did happen to turn round once, I remember, just as I was in the act of tumbling down for the first and only time, and her delight was but thinly veiled by her excessive solicitude and sympathy. I sent her the stamps, received the bottle, and resolved to let her drop out of my life. I had been a good Samaritan to her at the request of my friend, but the best of Samaritans resents the offer of healing oil for his own use. But why waste a thought on Minora at Easter, the real beginning of the year, in defiance of calendars? She belongs to the winter that is past, to the darkness that is over, and has no part or lot in the life I shall lead for the next 6 months. Oh, I could dance and sing for joy that the spring is here! What a resurrection of beauty there is in my garden, and of brightest hope in my heart! The whole of this radiant Easter day I have spent out of doors, sitting at first among the windflowers and celandines, and then, later, walking with the babies to the Hirschwald to see what the spring had been doing there. And the afternoon was so hot that we lay a long time on the turf, blinking up through the leafless branches of the silver birches at the soft, fat, little white clouds floating motionless in the blue. We had tea on the grass in the sun, and when it began to grow late and the babies were in bed and all the little windflowers folded up for the night, I still wandered in the green paths, my heart full of happiest gratitude. It makes one very humble to see one's self surrounded by such a wealth of beauty and perfection, anonymously lavished, and to think of the infinite meanness of our own grudging charities, and how displeased we are if they are not promptly and properly appreciated. I do sincerely trust that the benediction that is always awaiting me in my garden may by degrees be more deserved, and that I may grow in grace and patience and cheerfulness, just like the happy flowers I so much love. End of section 17. End of Elizabeth and Her German Garden, by Elizabeth von Arnim.